First, Dr. Fania Davis. Dr. Davis is a leading national voice on restorative justice, a field which invites us to make a fundamental shift in the way we think about and do justice. Restorative justice is based on a desired set of principles and practices to mediate conflict, strengthen community, and repair harm. Coming of age in Birmingham, Alabama during the social ferment of the civil rights era and witnessing the murder of two close childhood friends in the 1963 Sunday school bombing crystallized within Dr. Davis a passionate commitment to social transformation. For the next few decades, she was active in the civil rights movement, Black liberation movements, women's, prisoners, peace, anti-racist, and anti-apartheid movements. After receiving her law degree from the University of California, Berkeley in 1979, she practiced for some 27 years as a civil rights trial lawyer. During the 1990s, she started a PhD program in Indigenous studies at the California Institute of Integral Studies and apprenticed with Indigenous healers around the globe, particularly in Africa. Since earning her PhD in 2003, she has been engaged in a search for healing alternatives to adversarial justice. She has taught restorative justice at San Francisco's New College Law School and Indigenous peacemaking at Eastern Mennonite University's Center for Justice and Peacebuilding, and she speaks widely and writes about these topics. She has brought her restorative justice work to Oakland as founder and director of Restorative Justice of Oakland Youth. She served as counsel to the International Council of 13 Indigenous Grandmothers, and her numerous awards include the Ubuntu Award for Service to Humanity, the Dennis Maloney Award for Excellence in Youth Restorative Justice, and the World Trust's Healing Justice Award. The Los Angeles Times recently named her a new civil rights leader for the 21st century, and we are honored to have her words today. Her speech will be followed by a response from Dr. Talaya Tolfree, who has committed the last 2 decades of her life to community program development and providing educational leadership to children, parents, and educators in a variety of pre-K through post-secondary educational settings. Dr. Tolfree also recently authored her first children's book, Grandma Sankofa's House. And she is the founder and executive director of Empowered to Be Me, a girls' leadership program, as well as founder and CEO of the Koinonia Leadership Academy, where she uses her restorative practices engagement circle framework to implement restorative justice in faith-based organizations, schools, and communities. Dr. Tolfree is a restorative practices researcher and is involved in a number of initiatives in restorative practices focusing on healing, social, racial, and educational justice. Dr. Tolfree believes education is a human right and should be experienced in healthy and safe environments that are inclusive for all. She has practiced leadership and program development in the faith-based nonprofit community for several years. In her leadership role, she once served as early education director consultant for the St. Paul Project Spirit and Freedom School and Minneapolis Freedom School. She has been involved in and designed many programs committed to practicing servant leadership, community engagement, and social justice to provide children and families of African descent access to culturally responsive academic and social opportunities. Dr. Tolfree believes relational leadership is the core for building sustainable and effective organizational infrastructures that lead to effective leadership, positive student, family, and community outcomes. As a first-generation college graduate, Talaya Tolfree is committed to supporting underserved and underrepresented children and families and the organizations that serve them as they journey towards social, racial, and educational justice. Dr. Tolfree earned her BA in Human Services from Metropolitan State here in Minnesota, her master's degree in Educational Leadership from Luther Seminary, and her Doctor of Seminary in Servant Leadership from Bethel Seminary. She is the recipient of the 2021 Lola Parker Businesswoman of the Year Achievement Award, and she was awarded Bethel University's George K. Brushaber Reconciliation Award in 2009. Both of our opening speakers, as you will see, are giants in their own way, locally, nationally, and I would also add globally, in thinking about restorative practices as a cornerstone for building a peaceful and just society. And so I'm so glad that even though they are so busy applying this work and teaching restorative practices all around the country, including today, Dr. Tolfree is doing workshops here in the Twin Cities for parents and teachers, which is why she pre-recorded her talk. I hope that you will learn as much as I have already from these two amazing speakers. And with that, I'm going to step back, give you one last reminder that as you wish, please visit the Jamboard. As you listen to our speakers, record your impressions, ask questions, share resources, make statements, have ahas. And of course, you can always use the chat as well to share impressions with the rest of the people who are joining us from all over the country and all over the world this morning. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope that you have a wonderful experience with us of learning and engagement in the Smaby Peacebuilding Symposium.
Greetings. Thank you, Dean Catherine Squires. Thank you, Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Thank you for inviting me to open the 2021 Smaby Peacebuilding Symposium. I also want to greet and thank all of you in this room for taking time to attend the conference today. I greet and thank those of you on both sides of the Atlantic and those of you who are perhaps located in the global South. You are here as peace builders, healers, and activists. You are here because you committed to reducing violence and injustice, because you are committed, rather, to reducing violence and injustice in the world. After decades of considering the field of international peace building and transitional justice is relevant only to other countries, to Asia, Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe, this is finally changing. After years of considering genocide and massive human rights abuses as something that happened only in distant lands, we are finally looking into the mirror and seeing that we are those lands. And we deeply need peace ourselves. We're seeing that we need not travel to far off destinations. There is a dire need for peace-building work right here. I can't go on without acknowledging that I live, work, and play on the unceded territory of the Chochenyo Ohlone people in Oakland, California. Where are you? On whose land do you stand? I'm sure you've noticed, especially those of you in the US, that land acknowledgements are becoming a customary way to open public gatherings. This is an important peace development. Land acknowledgements recognize that, just as with slavery and the slave trade, we have yet as a nation to fully recognize, take responsibility for, and take reparative action for the colossal harms of colonization, genocide, land theft, and all their living legacies. Further, to invoke the original inhabitants of North American lands is also to acknowledge that ours is an occupied land. Every acre, no less than the West Bank or Ukraine, are occupied lands. Also, to invoke the land is to acknowledge ours as a post-genocidal land, no less than Germany or Rwanda are post-genocidal lands. We as a nation have always been quick to point the finger of blame to other nations whose governments have committed genocide and large-scale human rights abuses. Yet, as an African proverb says, when you point a finger at someone else, 3 fingers are pointing back at you. Unearthing the truth about harm, facing the truth unflinchingly, and publicly sharing these truths are the first essential steps on the road to creating a culture of accountability and peace for our nation. The 4 R's of restorative justice accountability are: 1, recognize history's pain; 2, take responsibility for it; 3, take action to repair it; and 4, take action to prevent recurrence. Recognition, responsibility, repair, non-recurrence. So you'll hear me repeating this throughout my talk. It's the restorative justice accountability mantra. It is applicable on collective and individual levels. It's the same for both. And restorative justice accountability also has process standards. Is the accountability process driven by values of radical respect, relationality, and responsibility? Does it center the voices of those most negatively impacted? Is it a process that seeks radical healing? Or is it a top-down, systems-dominated process? A process that reflects and replicates the same values and hierarchies of power that have caused harm in the first place. We can't get to a new place in an old way. Land acknowledgements recognize and take responsibility for history's pain. These are the first two R's of restorative justice accountability. And what about the other two R's? What about reparations? What about ensuring non-recurrence? And what about process? If your institution is doing land acknowledgements, is it also engaging in respectful dialogue with Indigenous people of the territory where it operates to learn what it needs to do to make reparations and ensure non-recurrence? Does the process center Indigenous voices? In California, the Ohlone people have asked non-Indigenous peoples, and institutions to pay the Shuumi land tax to support the ecological restoration of wildlife corridors and traditional creeks and waterways, the return of ancestral artifacts, the establishment of gardens, community centers, ceremonial spaces, and cemeteries to reinter stolen Ohlone remains, ancestral remains. The Shuumi land tax is an example, a very early one, of the reparations element of accountability. Land acknowledgements and reparations are peace practices. They are a way to peace in our nation. In my time with you today, I'd like to explore 4 areas. 1, the importance of the imagination in creating cultures of peace. 2, the inseparability of justice and peace. 3, restorative justice as a reimagined justice that can bring peace. And 4, the scores of anti-racist reparations, truth, and reimagining initiatives sweeping the nation today that beckon us toward a future of restorative justice, healing, and peace. First, on the importance of the imagination in creating a culture of peace, let me say I'm grateful that you have convened this conference on peace. With global images of carnage flooding the screens of our various devices every day, we have no trouble imagining war and violence. But we have a very hard time imagining peace. We rarely see images of peace. Our history books, our school curricula, films, theater, fairy tales, children's video games, popular literature and culture all depict and even exalt war, violence, and harm. Our cultural heroes and heroines are purveyors of violence. Peace builders and healers are rarely, if ever, highlighted. This applies even in racial and gender breakthrough productions like Black Panther and Wonder Woman. To create a culture of peace, we must first imagine it. We must not only reimagine public safety and justice, we must re-envision economics, health, education. We must indeed re-envision our entire culture, how we might live together in right relationship, how we might live together in peace, how we might live together as relatives in this beautiful creation. And so, to help us dream of and imagine peace, We need more conferences like this one. We need artists who release the old tropes of violence that dominate and disfigure our popular culture. We need artists who will create more children's books, video games, films, plays, television shows, and popular literature that envision a beautiful world of peace, justice, and healing. Now, to pivot to the second subject, peace as the presence of justice. During the civil rights era, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stated that, and I quote, "True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is a presence of justice." Dr. King further emphasized that structural violence and peace simply cannot coexist. Today, we hear this very same wisdom reverberating through the ranks of the Black Lives Matter movement and the slogan, "No justice, no peace." We are a nation born into structural violence. We are a nation born in oceans of blood, the blood of genocide, land theft, slavery, slave trade, colonialism, heteropatriarchy, racial capitalism, and human supremacy. We are a nation that for 4 centuries has lived in denial of these origins, in denial of this collective biography, allowing these birth traumas to ceaselessly reenact and replicate themselves. Given that slavery and genocide are not dead, and given their afterlives are very much present with us today in the form of mass incarceration, criminalization of immigration, racial disparities, voter suppression, police terror, ad infinitum, what kind of justice will bring peace? What kind of justice will bring peace? Given that structural violence and white supremacy are so totalizing, pervading and permeating all our institutions and collective consciousness, leaving nothing and no one untouched. Given all of this, what kind of justice is up to the task of engendering peace? It is clear the current way we think about and do justice will not bring peace. Rooted in slavery, convict leasing, the chain gang, Jim Crow, and continuing into the present with mass incarceration, the school to prison pipeline, and the criminalization of immigration, our current retributive justice system itself perpetuates injustice and untold harm. This is certainly not the justice that Dr. King had in mind when he said peace is the presence of justice. Also, the US way of justice can't bring social peace because it's designed to address only individual harm, and ineffectively and inequitably at that. Today, we realize racism isn't just individual, it is systemic. So true justice isn't about successfully prosecuting individuals, it's about reckoning with and disrupting entire histories, legacies, and systems of racial terror and white supremacy that, like monsters who we think are dead but keep coming back, relentlessly replicate and reproduce themselves. Plus, our criminal legal system looks backward to blame, judge, and punish people for past harm only. What about a forward-looking justice? What about stopping future harm? Also, in accusing, adjudicating, and sentencing, our system simply responds to the original harm with another harm. What about repair? What about stopping future harm again? A forward-looking justice that sets its sights on creating new futures where Black and people of color lives finally matter. A justice involving an inclusive accountability process led by those most negatively impacted and pursued by radically respectful, democratic, and relational means. True justice means a holistic justice that recognizes harm, repairs harm, and prevents recurrence. This gets back to the 4 R's of restorative justice. This leads me to the third point of my talk today. Restorative justice is a reimagined justice that can bring peace. Restorative justice is justice re-envisioned. It is a paradigm shift in the way we think about and do justice that has been dawning on the stage of human history for only a few decades. Yet its roots are ancient, predating and challenging the slave trade, genocide, and racial capitalism. Restorative justice is inspired by a vision of justice decolonized. It is rooted in indigenous insights, affirming humans' equal moral worth and dignity, and their inter-identity and reciprocal responsibility to one another and to the earth. Let's look at the fundamentals of restorative justice. In the prevailing retributive justice system, if I harm someone, this creates an imbalance in the scales of justice. And the only way to rebalance the scales is for me to be harmed. If I cause harm, I must be harmed, whether suspended or expelled in school settings, or punished, incarcerated, or executed in justice settings. We harm people who harm people to show that harming people is wrong. But this only multiplies, replicates, and reproduces harm, right? Go figure. This only adds to the collective energies of violence, moving us farther and farther away from peace. We can't expel darkness with darkness. Only light can do that, as Dr. Martin Luther King said. This is not a peace-loving justice, this justice of ours. This is certainly not the kind of justice that Dr. King was talking about when he said, peace is the presence of justice. Restorative justice brings light to darkness. It brings healing to harm. It brings peace. It's actually pretty simple. It all boils down to the 3 ways humans respond to conflict. 1, some strike back in vengeance. Retaliation is the first way. But as we said, that only replicates pain and violence. 2, others are conflict averse. So avoidance is a second way. But avoidance doesn't work because it's like a wound that never sees the sunlight, that just festers, gets infected, spreads and grows and never heals. Yet others lean into it. So leaning in is the 3rd way of responding to harm and conflict. Leaning into conflict allows all parties to grow, heal, and learn to live together in peace. Of course, our criminal injustice system responds in the first way with another harm, adding to the collective energies of violence. Our culture responds in the second way, sweeping under the rug, being in collective denial about our collective biography of white supremacy, of terror. This also causes wounds to become infected and spread. Restorative justice, on the other hand, takes the 3rd way. It leans into conflict in ways that are intended to help people to grow and nations to grow and learn from their mistakes. Of course, this increases the collective energies of peace. More than a program, restorative justice is a way of life, a worldview rooted in ancient wisdom traditions and center values of respect, relationality, responsibility, the 3 R's of restorative justice, as Howard Zehr calls them. I earlier talked about the 4 R's of restorative justice accountability. And so now we're talking about the 3 R's of restorative justice values. Radical respect is the first. I'm reminded of the Zulu greeting, Sawubona, or Sanibonani, plural. I see you. I see your goodness. I see your spirit. I see you beyond the worst thing you've ever done. I see you beyond the worst thing that's ever been done to you. So respect means unconditionally honoring that inherent goodness, honoring that spark of divinity present within every human being. The second restorative justice value is radical relationality, radical relationship. Restorative justice is rooted in Ubuntu, the profoundly communitarian view of Southern Africa that means I am because we are. We are because I am. We are who we are because of our relationships. We are relational beings. Restorative justice is based on the Lakota Sioux core value of Mitakuye Yasin, which means translated, all my relations. We are all relatives. We are here on earth to learn to take care of one another. Dr. King also talked about the inherently interrelated structure of reality. All humans are tied in an inescapable network of mutuality, in a single garment of destiny, he said. The third value is radical responsibility. We exist, all of us, in a web of reciprocality and interrelationship for good or bad. COVID-19 is an example of how this web of interrelatedness can be for the bad. But precisely because we are so deeply connected, we bear a responsibility to live in right relationship, to learn to live in a good way together. We have a responsibility to live in ways that don't cause harm to others. And if we do end up harming another, we are responsible for acknowledging that, taking responsibility, taking reparative action, and taking action to ensure non-recurrence. Again, the 4 R's of restorative justice accountability. Because it is a set of values, restorative justice can be creatively applied in diverse settings, in many settings, whether family, community, school, justice system, church, and others. We have restorative medicine. We have restorative environmental justice, restorative architecture, restorative economics. Restorative justice is the most researched alternative to the criminal justice system, and studies show it is more effective than retributive justice in holding responsible parties accountable. It transforms and significantly reduces reoffending by persons who have caused harm, whether in schools, justice, or other settings. It has higher levels of satisfaction among persons harmed who suffer less PTSD after a direct facilitated encounter with the persons who harmed them. Studies also show that it promotes empathy. It repairs damaged relationships. It promotes peace. I co-founded Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, a pioneering nonprofit, some years ago. Its first pilot program was so successful that with a push from student organizing, the school district adopted restorative justice as official school policy. By responding to youthful wrongdoing restoratively instead of punitively, We slashed suspension and arrest rates and saved thousands of children from the school to prison pipeline. Racial disparities and suspensions declined as well, although more work is needed in that area. At schools where restorative justice was implemented, we saw positive academic and social outcomes. Students learned to talk through instead of fight through their differences. And so we significantly reduced, and in some cases even eliminated altogether, violence. Girls who were long-time enemies became friends after sitting together in peacemaking circles. When community grief and healing circles were done in the wake of homicide, there was no retaliatory violence. Restorative justice is not a panacea. It's not a magic wand, and it's not always appropriate. If a party causing harm does not take full responsibility for harm they caused, the restorative justice process is not appropriate, because an encounter with the person harmed will only cause further harm. For almost 35 years, the United States restorative justice community had no racial or social justice consciousness to speak of, viewing itself more as a social service to spur individual transformation rather than a social movement to catalyze social transformation. It viewed itself as a social service and not as a social movement. Further, the restorative justice movement, like the peace, women's, environmental, and so many other movements, has been shaped or misshaped by the white supremacy and systemic racism that are so totalizing in our nation, permeating, pervading all of our institutions, our structures, our cultural domains, and collective consciousness. For its first 3.5 decades, therefore, restorative justice had no racial justice consciousness. Beginning about 2012, however, restorative justice practitioners of color like myself in the United States and their allies strategically and intentionally began influencing the US restorative justice community to adopt a restorative justice theory and praxis that center racial justice and honor its indigenous roots. As a result, the restorative justice movement today involves more people of color, including youth, more LGBTQIA persons, more formerly incarcerated persons, and more members of historically marginalized communities generally than ever before. And so for the first time, we're seeing increasing numbers of programs, publications, convenings, and conferences that address the intersections of racial and restorative justice. Yet more is needed. The responsibility for continued transformation falls on the shoulders of white restorative justice practitioners. In these times, white practitioners are being invited to step up to the plate in a big way as models of anti-Black racism. And now to my fourth and final topic, addressing this inflection point. We bear witness to an extraordinary historical moment, one convulsing with both immense pain and opportunity. The opportunity is we are finally looking in the mirror, finally facing the truth that we are a nation born not in liberty, but in terror of white supremacy, terror of slavery, of genocide, of land theft, of racial capitalism. At last, we are disrupting centuries of collective denial about who we are, about our collective biography. We are realizing our textbooks, curricula, literature, popular culture have all been sanitized to support the mythical narrative of American innocence, the land of the free, and the world's citadel of democracy. When looking at the truly extraordinary numbers of truth, reparations, and reimagining initiatives coming forth today, we can make out the outlines of an emergent justice glimmering on the horizon. A justice is being born that can bring peace. It's Georgetown University's $100 million reparations fund for descendants of enslaved persons who were sold to keep the university afloat to tell the story. It's Brown University's truth-telling about its complicity with slavery, its acts of repair, including a reparations fund and establishment of a center, a permanent center for the study of slavery. It's Yale, Harvard, Princeton, and the University of Virginia's truth-telling, memorialization, renaming, and reparations initiatives spurred by student activism. It's the totality of these and similar efforts of an estimated 75 additional higher education institutions, all of whom are members of the University Studying Slavery Consortium, that tell the story of a new justice dawning. It's Apple's $100 million equity reparations fund to establish learning hubs at historical Black colleges and universities, an academy in Detroit to support coding and tech education, and a venture capital fund to support Black and Brown entrepreneurs that prefigure this new justice. It's the reparations funds, commissions, and related initiatives springing up in the cities of Evanston, Burlington, Asheville, and literally hundreds of additional municipalities, and in state and federal legislative bodies, particularly House Resolution 40, to develop and study reparations proposals that, after 32 years of languishing in the Judiciary Committee, finally got out of committee recently. These all presage the new justice that is dawning. Thanks to the late Representative John Conyers, who introduced the bill, H.R. 40, in 1989, and to time-honored legacy reparations groups, the National Coalition for Black Reparations in America and the National African American Reparations Commissions. It's the removal of more than 110 Confederate statues, the erection of memorials in numerous localities, like Equal Justice Initiative's National Memorial for Peace and Justice to honor lynching victims, and its Legacy Museum to honor enslaved persons. It's the Black Lives Matter street renamings in more than 30 cities. It's the numerous educational institutions like Amherst that, pressed by student organizing, are publicly apologizing to students for implicit bias, harassment, stereotyping, invisibilizing, hypervisibilizing, underrepresenting, and other daily inequities, and are additionally engaging in reimagining strategies to become anti-racist institutions. It's the many additional public and private entities engaged in similar anti-racist transformative initiatives. It's the more than 20 major cities that are defunding police and transferring money to community agencies that are better equipped to respond to calls involving homeless or disabled persons and those struggling with drug addiction. It's similarly the 26 major cities taking police out of schools and replacing them with counselors, restorative justice facilitators, and peace ambassadors, like here in my hometown of Oakland, that foreshadow the emergent justice. In the arts, it's the We See You White American Theater Anti-Racist Transformative Initiative, the Reclamation Project at the Kennedy Center, and other strategies to repair historical harm and imagine a path forward in theater arts that portend the new justice on the horizon. Unprecedented numbers of transitional justice and truth and reconciliation type initiatives in San Francisco, Philadelphia, Boston, Iowa, Maryland, and additional municipalities in the nation that also augur a justice reimagined. These complex, diverse, variegated, decentralized, and self-organizing developments offer clues about what a reimagined, justice that will bring peace might look like. So in closing, exercise the muscles of your imagination and creativity. We can't create new public safety futures, new justice futures, new economic or new peace futures without first imagining them. Learn more about restorative justice practice through a racial justice lens and in ways that honor its indigenous roots. For white people, educate yourselves. This is a lifelong journey. Examine yourselves. Eradicate the ways you personally perpetuate systemic racism. Model what it means to be an anti-racist white person, an anti-racist white leader. Educate your own people. Don't rely on people of color to do that. The good news is that the wind is at your back. There are so many resources today, everything you need, books and organizations, other resources. Actively support and nurture the truth, reparations, memorialization, and reimagining initiatives bubbling up all over that I just discussed. Help ensure that these processes are respectful, healing, inclusive, relational, non-hierarchical, collaborative, and community-driven, rather than top-down and systems-dominated. Help ensure that they land on all 4 restorative justice accountability touchstones. Help midwife the birth of the new justice. Peace is a present and embodied practice. It's not something we defer to some point in the far-off future. Like yoga is a practice and meditation is a practice, peace is an emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual discipline that takes time, commitment, self-regulation, and regular practice. That's not just what do we need to do to bring peace, but who do we need to be to bring peace? Through restorative justice, peacemaking circles, and other models, create liberated spaces where we as communities can practice together being present to one another in ways that bring peace. Be peace. These embodied practices and spaces call forth the new future. The future is now. Last, take precious good care of yourself. Eat mostly whole plant-based foods, commune with the earth. Commit to a regular mind-body awareness or spiritual practice. Get enough sleep. And surround yourself with positive, nurturing energies and relationships. Laugh, cry, dance, and love. Thank you so much.
Peace to all of you healers and activists. I bring you greetings from the unceded land of the Dakota and Ojibwe Native people of Minnesota. I thank you, Dean Dr. Catherine Squires, Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and the Smaby Peacebuilding Symposium for inviting me to participate as a restorative healer, offering a response to Dr. Fania Davis's incredibly powerful keynote. Dr. Davis, I thank you for such a powerful and rich meta-narrative that centered truth-telling, followed up by a call to action that beckons us to transform our minds from punitive ideologies, language, and practices that cause harm, hurt, and violence to humanity, to embrace restorative ideologies, languages, and practices that restore, heal, and repair harm, to build meaningful relationships, which is the core of restorative practices. As I coach and mentor educators about restorative practices, oftentimes 2 questions arise. 1, who can do restorative practices? And 2, where can restorative practices be done? My response is, restorative practices is a mindset, a way of being, Therefore, it can be practiced by all of humanity, and it can be practiced anywhere there are human beings. As Dr. Davis points out, this requires a mindset shift. I encourage you to consider when we translate our restorative mindsets into action, it becomes the language of humanity. This restorative language gives us voice to help us express our lived experiences. This language creates spaces of healing. The language of restorative practices allows us to be heard, to articulate our values and why we want others to value us. This language expresses our need to be respected. Dr. Davis talked about the meaning of respect, to unconditionally honor that inherent goodness, that spark of divinity present within our very human being. When we transfer our restorative mindsets into action, it becomes the language of humanity that articulates our need to be connected in community. Dr. Davis talked about an African way of understanding community, Ubuntu. I am because we are. We are because I am. We are who we are because of our relationships. This aligns with the Lakota Sioux's interpretation of human community. We are all relatives. We are all on earth to take care of one another. Restorative practices are not just another checklist, curriculum, or program to learn. Having restorative mindset means engaging everyone in the language of shared humanity. The Indigenous ways of being in community, in relationship to all humanity. As Dr. Davis says, I see you. I see your goodness. I see your spirit. I see you beyond the worst thing you've ever done, beyond the worst thing that has ever been done to you. Dr. Davis says, restorative justice is a forward-looking justice that set its sights on creating a new future where Black and people of color lives truly matters. True justice means a holistic justice that recognizes harm, repairs harm, and prevents harm. She reminds us of the necessary practice of critical self-reflection on a micro level as well as a macro level. On a micro level, as an individual, examining how we avoid, suppress, and perpetuate harm, and how we, on a macro level, as a country, avoid, suppress, and perpetuate harm. Each time we choose to be silent when we witness social and racial injustices. We must get to the point where we truly sit with the injustices upon which this country was built. Dr. Davis asked us to look in the mirror. We are no less than the caste systems that we point our finger to, while there are 3 fingers pointing back at us. Dr. Davis calls for all humanity to make that paradigm shift away from punitive treatment and begin to understand restorative justice as a reimagined justice that can bring peace and healing to all humanity. This is a call to awaken the collective moral consciousness of America, to reimagine a humane justice. In response to that call, I would like to share with you 4 ways I am taking action in our community to create a reimagined justice in partnership with local healers as we work with our school systems, our youth, and our legal system. In school-based settings, I use my Indigenous Restorative Practices Engagement Circle framework that begins with 3 big ideas that paradigm shift and reimagining justice can begin with. First, having a growth mindset that challenges one to reimagine and engage in critical self-reflection about traditional ways of schooling versus restorative ways of schooling.
Okay, hold on.
Second,
Hold on.
use a race equity lens throughout the entire process, asking about policies, procedures, and practices that either hurt or harm our scholars. Thirdly, incorporate the first 2 to begin to develop a restorative mindset that will allow one to make the necessary paradigm shift away from punitive practices to restorative practices. Ubuntu is at the center of my Indigenous Restorative Practices Engagement Circle framework. Our implementation process includes scholars, parents, community members, and experienced Indigenous restorative practices practitioners to create a system of accountability, transparency, equity, and fidelity throughout the process for the good of the community. Next, Empowered to Be Me. Empowered to Be Me is a girls' leadership program of Koinonia Leadership Academy. The program was inspired by Black girls who shared their personal experiences with me. After our discussions, we began to do some reimagining about restorative spaces of healing and affirmation of Blackness. As a result, Empowered to Be Me was born 3 years ago. As Dr. Monique Morris has brought to the world's attention, Black girls of African descent are being discarded in our educational system and being funneled into the school to prison pipeline. Dr. Morris points out the school to prison pipeline is a framework that is primarily based on the experiences of boys. She asserts the school to confinement pathways includes multiple pathways girls are confined, like residential placement, detention centers, home placement, etc. I believe in Black girls, and I understand firsthand that Black girls of African descent need to be tended to as they have a unique epistemological experience in this world. They are forced to watch their brothers, fathers, and cousins be publicly lynched. They experience adultification and are denied leadership opportunities. They have few safe places to process and be restored. The Empowered to Be Me curriculum is designed to restore and empower Black girls to their authentic selves while discovering their genius through leadership development. Our girls partner with Black women to co-create safe and nurturing spaces to explore a variety of leadership development opportunities where young girls can have an opportunity to grow and develop. Youth participatory action research is what we're focusing on this summer. We are focusing on restorative practices and Black girl mental health as we work through the scars and trauma of the dual pandemics of racism and COVID-19. Next is our 846 Collective. The 846 Collective began as a local healing space for youth in response to and in solidarity with the worldwide collective response to the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that led to the murder of George Floyd. Koinonia Leadership Academy partners with Twin Cities Innovational Alliance, St. Peter's AME Church, and Canopy Mental Health and Consulting, where they provide culturally responsive mental health services to historically underserved populations. Our purpose is to co-create a self-care and healing space for people of African descent. The 846 Collective has evolved into an intergenerational space focused on healing, self-care, and wellness as we continue to experience similar traumas. It is imperative that we have a space to connect, restore, heal, engage, and build community. Lastly, the Youth Restorative Justice Disposition Program started as a pilot last year, and just recently, a few weeks ago, we've developed into a program. The Youth Restorative Justice Disposition Program is a collaborative effort between Koinonia Leadership Academy, Legal Rights Center, Restorative Justice Community Action, and the University of Minnesota's Healthy Youth Development Prevention Research Center, with support from the International Academy of Trial Lawyers. This reimagined restorative justice program is for youth ages 14 to 17 in Hennepin County. Our goal is to shift traditional decision-making processes to deeply and meaningfully engage youth and family through a restorative practices framework. We use a race equity lens to take meaningful action to address racial disparities in the juvenile justice system. Families are given an option to choose the traditional court process or our restorative process, which allows them an opportunity to work with us. The family determines their support system. We create a safe space using the restorative circle process, including the youth and their family and the support system, probation officer and community members to develop a plan for accountability and a process to repair harm. This restorative process is done in community and determined by the family. Statistics show that youth who have an opportunity to engage in restorative processes are less likely to experience recidivism. I want to thank you again for this opportunity to share the ways in which I am reimagining justice through an Indigenous restorative practices lens. For more about our programs and the tools that we offer, you can reach us at koinonialeadershipacademy.com, and you may contact me. And you also can reach the Legal Rights Center, and the contact there is Sarah Davis. The Restorative Justice Community Action Center, the contact there is Cynthia Prozek. The Canopy Mental Health and Consulting, the contact there is Jimmy Higgs and Cherie Hansen. And then the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance, which you will hear from later in this week's program, Ms. Marika Pfefferkorn. She is the co-founder and the Solutions and Sustainability Officer. And I also want to offer you to check our website, Koinonia Leadership Academy's website, click on Children's Literacy, and then you will see some of the literacy that we are creating for our children, our earliest learners. And our first book is Grandma Sankofa's House, which teaches us the ways in which we use restorative practices in community. Peace be with you all as you continue your journey of engaging in peace practices for all of humanity. We thank you for being with us today.